Napoleon and the Fair Sex. Introduction. A large proportion of the chapters in this book appeared in the literary supplement of the Figaro from April to September 1893. The idea of writing them was suggested to me in the following manner. In the Chronicle, published periodically in connection with the journal, an anonymous correspondent asked the questions, with what women is Napoleon known to have had temporary relations as a young man, as consul, and finally as emperor? Had he an absorbing passion for any one woman? And if so, for whom? Answers to these queries appeared at intervals, but were far from convincing. It came to the knowledge of Monsieur Perivier, the editor of the literary supplement, that I had for some time past collected documents bearing on the private life of Napoleon. He applied to me for the desired information, and I gave it. But it was impossible to do justice to the subject within the prescribed limits, and my summary was but a brief outline of the facts I had gathered. It was then suggested that I should fill in this outline, and the result was a series of articles in the form of production of which I was allowed absolute liberty, but to which the Figaro offered a hospitality I now most gratefully acknowledge. The articles found favor with the public and were quoted in many journals, both at home and abroad. But on the other hand, they drew down upon me no small share of anonymous abuse and covert reproach. Many of those with whom I had stood shoulder to shoulder in the Bonapartist ranks between 1870 and 1879, from the fall of the empire to the death of the Prince Imperial, took exception to these articles as ill-timed and disrespectful, though they acquitted me alike of dissimulation of present sympathies or treachery to past traditions they held, and some among them openly told me that my passion for writing, my desire to figure prominently in a well-known review and to cater for a public greedy of unpublished gossip had seduced me into revelation and discussion of matters I ought to have suppressed. They pronounced my Bonapartism not at all to their liking, and declared that a devotee of Napoleon who dealt thus with his memory was hardly to be distinguished from his enemies. Such were the accusations brought against me. I seek neither to exaggerate nor to minimize them, but it would be easy to pass over them in silence, but for 20 years I shared the passions, the hopes, the joys and sorrows of my accusers. The friendship of many among them is very dear to me, nor would I willingly forfeit the esteem of any. I therefore gladly take this opportunity of justifying myself. I ask the indulgence of a public to whom these disputes are of little interest, to whom my very existence is almost unknown, who are ignorant of my past, and who may look upon these pages as a superfluous affix to the book for which they have paid their money. But hitherto my loyalty has never been called in question. I have held my course with all singleness of heart and purpose, and it would ill become me to shrink from an explanation which has long seemed to be necessary and has now become imperative. The present book is the first of a series of studies I propose to publish successively. In these, it is my intention to give the result of my researches with absolute independence. I therefore owe it to my old political friends to explain what led me formerly to join their ranks and why I now feel at liberty to follow my own bent and write after my own fashion, recognizing in them no rights either as dictators or censors. The Bonapartist staff after 1870 was largely recruited from the ranks of the Orleanist and Legitimist parties, even though sometimes supporters of the Revolution of 1848 who had rallied to Prince Louis Napoleon were largely influenced by reactionary sympathies. They were all pledged to the cause of the fallen empire by virtue of places they had held, favors conferred on themselves or their families, anxiety to play a new part, and a very natural ambition to recover a lost position or achieve one yet more brilliant. They prided themselves in their knowledge of the sole system of administration proper to their country. This system they had applied with unquestionable ability, with a rectitude to which the world is now beginning to do tardy justice, and with a professional equity no longer to be found among politicians. Each one among them may fairly claim to have largely contributed to the material prosperity enjoyed by France for 40 years. They had all the virtues of their caste together with one not common in that caste, the virtue of self-sacrifice. They were agreed that in 1852, as in the year 7, the empire was clearly in principle a delegation of the national sovereignty. Great, therefore, as was the repugnance of some among them to universal suffrage, they were bound to refrain from overtly attacking it. But they held the rights of discussion already acquired to be amply sufficient, resigned themselves much against the grain to a new plebiscite, and looked with abhorrence on all schemes of democratic government which ignored hereditary rights. The empire found favor among them, not only because it was an authoritative system agreeable to men who frankly detested parliamentarianism, at least so long as they themselves had no part in it, but because they saw in its dynastic and hereditary formula a practical compromise between the monarchy they regretted and those elements of democracy they recognized as inevitable. They beheld in the emperor not the predestined organizer of a new society, but the guardian of the interests of the old. On these issues, the majority of them were so closely allied to conservatism that they were finally merged among the conservatives, or partisans of the two Bourbon dynasties. With these, they were agreed on all points save that of the origin of authority and some few secondary details of its application, and doubtless had a Napoleon set himself to impugn their doctrines, they would have sacrificed the leader to their creed. The legislative, religious, and political program formulated in the first Napoleon's acts, edicts, and plans of government were accepted by them with certain explicit reservations. On some points they altogether withheld their adhesion, but Napoleon III was too present a reality to be thus set aside upon occasion. His advanced tendencies were, however, freely canvassed. Some of the measures proposed by him were denounced as strangely revolutionary, and though his followers were by no means loath to accept the credit of certain improvements in the condition of the people initiated by him, they considered that the maximum had been attained in this direction, and that further progress on lines formerly marked out would imperil the whole social fabric. To give but 2 instances in illustration, it is undeniable that the right of workmen to strike and the necessity of primary education had few, if any, supporters. In foreign policy, the anomaly was even greater. Not one among them would have upheld the principle of nationality, nor would any voice have been raised in defense of the war undertaken in the cause of Italian independence. The Crimean and Chinese campaigns found few apologists. In fact, any who had attempted to sum up the opinions held by Napoleon III, which the chiefs of the Bonapartist faction had assimilated, would have been surprised to find how few were the doctrines in common between the chief and his followers. The latter, indeed, professed theories adapted from legitimists, Orleanists, and even parliamentary republicans, and thus there grew up a Bonapartism lacking Bonapartist spirit, as conspicuously as it now lacks a Bonaparte. This annihilation of the Napoleonic doctrine by those who, in all sincerity, declared themselves its champions was a gradual process. The work of disintegration was first clearly manifested when certain members of the party in the National Assembly formed a faction and combined with other factions for the overthrow of Thiers and the nomination of McMahon. Thenceforward, they formed a mere item in the Conservative Union, and as the great majority of that union were royalists, The Bonapartist interest was gradually merged in theirs. Daily contact, parliamentary alliances, and social intimacy caused a fusion of opinions, which differed rather in degree than in principle. Until a lapse of 23 years, it is difficult to distinguish between the politics of deputies who were elected as Bonapartists and those who had declared for monarchy. It may be readily supposed that this group of politicians considered themselves invested by popular mandate with special authority. They naturally held that their presence in the field of politics, their participation in the actual government of the country, and their facilities for keeping watch on the course of public events marked them out as guardians of their party's interests. They therefore only accepted their prince's mandates ad referendum and subject to discussion, on many occasions rejecting them altogether when the execution of his orders seemed likely to imperil their re-election. They openly rebelled, for it was a cardinal doctrine with them that their presence in the Senate was essential to the welfare of the party, and thus unconscious apparently that they were degrading the one political principle that remained to them, they substituted for the doctrine of authority a parliamentarianism, all the more rigid, that the atoms of their own parliamentary microcosm had lost the habit of obedience, each considering himself peculiarly fitted to command. Thus, by degrees, the stronger elements of Bonapartism were watered down during the minority of the Prince Imperial parliamentarianism gained ground among the leaders of the party when, on the attainment of his majority, the prince sought to assume his rightful authority. He met with such strong opposition that he probably planned his expedition to Zululand in the hope of winning a prestige that would enable him to hold his own on his return. No sooner did Prince Napoleon attempt to assume the leadership than the party broke into open revolt, which was even more violent in its manifestations when he ventured to disassociate himself from the royalists. Matters are less complex at the present time. Both faction and party are no more. The one has effaced the other. The party is merged in the nation. But should the nation discover a man in whose person her aspirations towards glory, authority, and social reform take tangible shape, the popular current will revert to its former channel. The party will take a new lease of life. And if the man be equal to his destiny, the machinations of the middle-class parliament man will prove futile indeed when opposed to the triumphant progress of him whom Carlyle so aptly calls the hero. Such a vision will find realization sooner or later, or France will be no more. This is my earnest conviction, a conviction that has survived even the strange episode of some few years ago. The man whose wonderful fortune seemed to be bearing him on towards supreme power failed to grasp the prize and fell almost at the moment of attainment. But this was because of his own inherent weakness. He was unequal to the great part he was called upon to play. A Caesar is neither to be improvised nor developed. He must be born. I owe nothing to the empire, no family ties, no favors bound to me. To the Bonapartes, up to the age of 16, I received a national pension of 600 francs, the price of my father's life. He was killed June 23rd, 1848, the Republic adopting me and other orphans in the same cause made the award. It will hardly be contended that it was excessive or that I became a Republican on the strength of it. An ardent Republican I was, however, under the empire. A result brought about my classic education, my lonely youth, my passion for literature, and a certain austerity of temperament. I dreamed of a republic founded on virtue, such as Montesquieu desired, and seen through the mists of legend, the men of the Revolution seemed to me the most virtuous beings who had ever existed. I had no misgivings as to the rectitude of their successors, and believed the mountain to be the chosen asylum of high-minded patriots, pure of soul and spotless of hand, when alone of all constitutions seemed to me to rest on a legal basis, to emanate from the sovereignty of the people, and to contain the fundamental articles of the Republican faith. This was the Constitution of '93. It is true that it had never been carried out to its logical conclusion, but its theories might have been the creation of Rousseau himself. Such dreams are healthy. Napoleon himself has said there have been good men among the Jacobins. At one period, all exalted natures were attracted to Jacobinism. I myself was so attracted, like thousands of other well-meaning persons. I need not blush to confess myself of the company, those who feel no draft towards such notions in their youth, who are never in extremes, who confine their ambitions to the practical and the moderate, will no doubt prove the better architects of their own fortunes, the sure guardians of their own interests, but these will never have felt upon their brows the refreshing shadow of those vast wings in which the spirit soars above the mud of earth to the eternal home of the true and generous souls, the land of the sage and of the seer. They will not have retained from this rapid flight through ideal heights a perpetual aspiration towards progress, the one religion that stands the test of criticism and analysis. They will know nothing of the joys of disinterested search after truth. They will be men, not of principles, but of expedience. They will adapt themselves to circumstances and will support the form of government that offers them the highest wages. These are the successful men who are praised for their dexterity, but for oneself it would seem the better part to accept the blame of the herd and to dwell among honest men. Belief in the Constitution of 1793 is apt to be a passing phase with one who has a taste for research and a passion for knowledge. My enthusiasm for the men of the past gradually died out under the weight of evidence gleaned from books, pamphlets, and newspapers, and a little experience of humanity showed me the men of the present very much as they actually were among the constitutions which had been submitted to the nation, and so were of legal origin according to the democratic code. That of the year 8 seemed to me to have been vitiated by Brumaire the 18th, that of 1852 by December the 2nd. Yet I found it difficult to understand why such a solemn consultation 4 times repeated should have had identical results, whatever the pressure brought to bear upon the people. Was it possible to suppose that they could not have found some means of expressing their hatred and contempt if the men who solicited their votes were indeed as odious to them as they were represented to be, and if the programs submitted to them were indeed so repugnant to their feelings? This was a mystery on which I pondered deeply. Further, if the plebiscite of 1851 were void, the popular election of 1848 held good, and in that connection there could be no question of pressure or intimidation. If undue influence had been used, it had been on the other side. The popular mind, throwing off the trammels of the middle classes, had declared itself with one accord on that eventful day, and with marvelous unanimity had pronounced for Napoleon, and this in the face of the most unblushing official candidature, the most frantic parliamentarian efforts, the dread of deportation, the shadow of civil war, the spectacle of blood-stained bayonets, in the face, too, of ridicule and lampoons, of an unscrupulous press, of the whole body of the police in full cry, of a ministry of worthy gentlemen stopping coaches. It was a manifestation no less magnificent than extraordinary and almost unique in history. Here was the true birth certificate of the Second Empire, a document of unimpeachable authenticity. I recognized its authority, and this recognition was of no slight moment, seeing that it involved condemnation of a violated oath, of projected massacres, of the dissolution of the assembly, and a negation of all the doctrines of the châtiment, the textbook of my generation. This was not to be achieved without a struggle, especially by one who had contributed to the literature of the political controversy.